The morning began as every morning had for the past 10 years, in silence and shadow, with Arabella Fairfax moving through the grand townhouse on Belgrave Square like a ghost who had forgotten she was ever alive. The March dawn filtered weakly through the tall windows of the servants' entrance, casting grey light across the flagstones as she descended from her attic room, her footsteps making no sound on the worn stairs, because she had learned long ago to move without disturbing the air itself, to exist without evidence of existing. Her hands, reddened from cold water and lye soap, carried the heavy copper water cans up 3 flights to the family bedchambers. Her back bent under the weight, her breath coming in quiet gasps that she suppressed because even breathing felt like an intrusion in this house where she was permitted to labor but never to be. The Whitmore townhouse was elegant in the way of declining fortunes, all gilt and brocade in the public rooms where society might observe, but threadbare carpets in the corridors where only servants walked, the contrast a perfect symbol of the family itself, beautiful surfaces concealing rot beneath. Arabella had once known these rooms as a resident rather than a servant, had walked these halls in muslin gowns with her head high, had sat at the breakfast table with Lady Whitmore and Lydia when she was their ward, their cousin's orphaned daughter, taken in after the fever, claimed both her parents within a week of each other when she was 16 years old. She had been Arabella Fairfax then, daughter of Emmeline Gardiner Fairfax and Thomas Fairfax, a girl with prospects and a small inheritance, and a future that seemed, if not brilliant, then at least secure. But that was before Lord Whitmore's investments failed, or so he claimed, before her inheritance of £8,000 simply vanished into the mist of his bookkeeping, before the morning after her 18th birthday, when Lady Whitmore had called her into the drawing-room and explained with cold precision that circumstances had changed, that the money was gone, that Arabella might stay in the household if she wished, but in a different capacity, as a lady's maid to Lydia, earning her keep. And what choice did an 18-year-old orphan have except to say yes and yes and yes until the word lost all meaning? 10 years had passed since that morning, and in those 10 years Arabella had not once been addressed by her Christian name, not once been called Miss Fairfax, not once been acknowledged as anything other than the girl or you there, or simply a gesture, a pointed finger, an expectation that she would know what was wanted without the dignity of being spoken to directly. She prepared Lady Whitmore's breakfast tray with mechanical precision, the teapot aligned just so, the toast cut into precise triangles, the marmalade in the crystal dish that was only for family, never for servants. And as she arranged the morning newspapers, she caught sight of her reflection in the silver tea service, a distorted face that she barely recognized, 32 years old but looking older, her chestnut hair streaked with premature grey, her eyes the color of amber, but dimmed now, as though the light behind them had been extinguished slowly over the years until only habit kept them open. She looked away quickly because sometimes when she saw herself, she felt a terrible panic rising in her chest, a sensation that she was disappearing entirely, that one morning she would wake and find she had no face at all, just a blank space where a person used to be. Arabella, she thought to herself as she climbed the stairs to Lydia's chamber, her name a small rebellion in the privacy of her mind. Arabella Fairfax. My mother was Emmeline. My father was Thomas. I had a name once. I was someone once. I existed. But the words felt hollow even in her thoughts, because what use was a name that was never spoken? What good was an identity that no one acknowledged? And there were nights, deep, terrible nights, when she lay in her narrow attic bed and could not quite remember who Arabella Fairfax had been, when the girl she used to be seemed like a story she had read rather than a life she had lived. Lydia's chamber was warm, a fire already crackling in the grate because Lydia could not bear the cold, and the room smelled of rose water and the faintly sour scent of sleep. Expensive things and bodily things mingled together. Lydia herself was still abed, her blonde hair in curl papers, her face creased from the pillow, and at 28 she had the peevish look of a woman who had expected life to deliver certain rewards and found herself still waiting. "Do stop fumbling, girl," Lydia snapped as Arabella began laying out her morning dress, a confection of primrose silk that had cost more than Arabella would earn in 5 years if she were actually paid wages, which she was not. "At your age, one would think you would have mastered a simple corset." Arabella's hands trembled slightly as she laced the stays, pulling the ribbons through the eyelets with practiced efficiency, her fingers knowing the work even as her mind drifted elsewhere, to the garden party that afternoon, to the Duke of Ashford, who would be attending, to the small spark of curiosity she felt about a man she had never met, but whose name carried through London drawing rooms like a promise or a threat depending on who spoke it. "Oh, but then you never had proper training, did you?" Lydia continued, admiring herself in the glass as Arabella arranged her hair. "Father was too kind, taking you in like charity, giving you a position when you had nothing and no one." The words were calculated cruelty, a reminder of Arabella's fall, and once she might have flinched. But after 10 years she had learned to let such barbs pass over her like rain over stone, absorbing nothing, feeling nothing, because feeling was a luxury she could no longer afford. Lady Whitmore swept into the chamber without knocking, her morning dress of violet merino wool impeccable, her hair already dressed, her expression sharp and assessing as she examined her daughter. "The Duke of Ashford is attending today," she announced, her voice clipped and businesslike. "Lydia, this is your opportunity. He has recently returned from his estates and society says he is finally considering marriage at 35. You must be at your most charming, most agreeable. He is wealthy beyond measure, and his bloodline is impeccable. If you can secure his interest, it will save this family from our current difficulties." Arabella felt rather than saw Lady Whitmore's gaze flick over her, a glance of dismissal so complete it was almost violent. And then the older woman turned to the housemaid, hovering in the doorway. "Tell the girl to bring my shawl, the Norwich silk. I shall need it for the carriage," Lady Whitmore said, speaking as though Arabella were not standing 3 feet away, as though she were invisible, or deaf, or simply not human enough to merit direct address. The housemaid bobbed a curtsy and scurried away, and Arabella continued pinning Lydia's hair, her face carefully blank, her heart carefully blank. Everything about her carefully blank because blankness was safety. Blankness was survival. The morning progressed with its usual rituals, the family breaking their fast in the dining room while Arabella stood against the wall in case she was needed. The soft clink of silverware and china, the rustle of newspapers, Lord Whitmore hidden behind the Times, his jowly face occasionally visible when he turned a page, his expression perpetually disgruntled, as though the world owed him something it refused to deliver. Arabella studied him sometimes when she was certain no one was watching, this man who had stolen her inheritance and her future, and she tried to feel hatred, but found only a weary sort of contempt, the way one might feel about a rat in the larder, distasteful but ultimately just following its nature. After breakfast, she helped Lydia change into her walking dress for the garden party, a creation of leaf green taffeta with blonde lace at the collar and cuffs, and as she fastened the tiny buttons up the back of the bodice, she let her mind wander to her attic room, to the small trunk under her bed, where she kept the few possessions she had managed to preserve from her old life. There was a miniature portrait of her mother, painted when Emmeline Fairfax was newly married, her dark hair curled fashionably, her amber eyes so like Arabella's own, her smile gentle and knowing. There was her father's watch, silver and heavy, the chain tarnished now but still beautiful. And there was a book, the collected poems of Wordsworth, a gift from her mother on Arabella's 15th birthday, the leather binding worn soft from years of reading, the pages filled with her mother's penciled notes in the margins, observations and thoughts that made Arabella feel less alone when she read them late at night. Arabella, she would think as she turned those pages, Arabella Fairfax, daughter of Emmeline and Thomas, a girl who loved poetry, who walked by the river, who had a mother who called her darling and a father who called her his clever girl. I existed. I was real. I had a name. But in the daylight hours, moving through the Whitmore house with her silent footsteps and her downcast eyes, it was hard to believe that girl had ever existed at all, hard to remember what it felt like to hear her name spoken with affection rather than cruelty or not spoken at all. The household departed for the garden party in 2 carriages, the family in the first with its crested doors and well-sprung seats, Arabella and the other servants in the second, a hired conveyance that smelled of mildew and someone else's cigars. And as they rolled through the London streets toward Hyde Park, she pressed her face to the window and watched the city pass by, the grand houses of Mayfair giving way to the green expanse of the park where the ton gathered to see and be seen. Spring was attempting to arrive despite the cold, crocuses pushing through the hard ground, trees beginning to bud, the air carrying a hint of something softer than winter, though March in London was never truly gentle. Arabella climbed down from the carriage and immediately set about her duties, carrying Lydia's shawl and reticule, staying 3 paces behind as the family joined the fashionable crowd promenading along the Serpentine. And she made herself small and invisible, as she had learned to do, a shadow attending her mistress, a non-person whose only purpose was to anticipate needs and fulfill them silently. She watched the fine ladies in their spring silks, the gentlemen in their perfectly cut morning coats, the children running with hoops and balls while their nurses called after them, and she felt the familiar ache of displacement, of being present, but not belonging, of seeing a world she had once inhabited now separated from her by an unbridgeable gulf of lost fortune and lost name. Somewhere in this crowd was the Duke of Ashford, the man Lady Whitmore had set her sights on for Lydia, the most eligible bachelor in England according to the whispers Arabella heard among the other servants, a man of impeccable lineage and considerable wealth who had somehow managed to avoid matrimony into his 30s, and Arabella felt a flicker of sympathy for him, this stranger who would be hunted through the season by ambitious mothers and desperate daughters who would be assessed and pursued and schemed over as though he were a prize to be won rather than a man with his own thoughts and feelings. But such thoughts were dangerous, were above her station now, and she pushed them away as she had learned to push away all thoughts that reminded her she had once been educated, once been fit for a different kind of life, once been a person who mattered. The March wind picked up, sending ladies clutching at their bonnets, and gentlemen steadying their hats, and Arabella pulled her worn shawl more tightly around her shoulders, the thin wool barely adequate against the cold, and waited for whatever the afternoon would bring, invisible and silent, a woman without a name, in a world that had forgotten she ever had one. The garden party unfolded with all the predictable rituals of the London season, ladies promenading in their finest spring silks while gentlemen offered arms and compliments, mammas positioning their daughters in strategic locations like chess pieces on an elaborate board. And through it all, Arabella moved like water around stone, invisible and necessary, carrying Lydia's Norwich silk shawl when the sun grew warm, producing her painted fan when the exertion of walking made her mistress flush, holding her reticule and gloves and the small parasol that Lydia declared too precious to actually use. The afternoon sun filtered through the newly budding trees along the Serpentine, casting dappled shadows across the carefully tended lawns where white tents had been erected for refreshments, and a string quartet played Mozart from a raised platform, the music floating across the park like something from another world, beautiful and untouchable. Arabella stationed herself behind a large oak tree where she could observe Lydia without being observed herself, and from this vantage point she watched the arrival of the Duke of Ashford, Sebastian Wentworth, who entered the park with the kind of quiet authority that needed no announcement, the crowd simply parting for him as water parts for a ship's prow. He was tall, she noted, perhaps 35, as Lady Whitmore had said, with dark hair that wanted to curl despite being severely brushed back, and features that were more interesting than handsome, strong rather than pretty, a face that suggested intelligence and a certain weariness, as though he had seen enough of society to find it tedious, but was too well bred to show it. Within moments he was surrounded, a flock of pastel gowns and eager faces, mammas pushing their daughters forward with varying degrees of subtlety, and Arabella saw the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the way his smile remained fixed and polite, while something behind it retreated to a safe distance. Lady Whitmore descended on him with Lydia in tow, her daughter's practiced smile bright and empty as a new shilling, and Arabella watched the familiar performance, Lydia's tinkling laugh at something the Duke said, her artful deployment of the fan, the way she tilted her head just so to display the column of her throat. All the calculations of courtship reduced to mechanical gestures that had been rehearsed until they appeared natural. The Duke bowed over Lydia's hand with perfect courtesy, but Arabella, who had learned to read faces in the margins of rooms, saw no particular interest in his expression, only the patient endurance of a man fulfilling social obligations he found tiresome. The music shifted to a livelier piece, and couples began to stroll the paths in pairs, the crowd dispersing slightly, and Arabella relaxed her vigilance for a moment, allowing herself to simply listen to the quartet, to let the beauty of the violin's voice wash over her like rain after drought. And she closed her eyes and remembered her mother playing the pianoforte in their old drawing-room, remembered singing together, remembered when music was something she participated in rather than something she heard from a distance. The moment of peace shattered when Lydia's voice cut across the lawn, high and artificially distressed. "Oh, how clumsy of me! I have spilled lemonade all over my gown!" And Arabella's eyes snapped open to see Lydia standing with a spreading stain across the green taffeta, the glass tilted just so in her hand, in a way that suggested the accident was entirely deliberate, and Lady Whitmore was already gesturing sharply in Arabella's direction. "You there! Fetch the spare shawl from the carriage immediately, the rose silk, quickly now before the Duke loses interest." And Arabella understood at once that this was strategy, that the ruined gown was meant to give Lydia an excuse to withdraw and return looking fresh and charming, a second entrance to recapture the Duke's attention. She gathered her skirts and ran, her worn half-boots slipping slightly on the grass, her breath coming hard because she had eaten almost nothing that morning, and the corset beneath her plain grey dress was laced tight to give her the appearance of a proper figure, and she reached the line of carriages where the Whitmore conveyance waited, retrieved the rose silk shawl from the compartment under the seat where spare items were stored, and turned to hurry back. The path she chose was a shortcut through a more secluded section of the park, a narrow trail bordered by early crocuses pushing their purple heads through the hard earth, and she was moving too quickly, her mind already calculating how long Lydia would be angry if she took too long, when she collided with something solid and warm and utterly unexpected. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs and sent her stumbling backward, the shawl flying from her hands to land in the dirt of the path, and for a terrible moment she could not process what had happened, could only register the sensation of panic flooding her body, because she had bumped into someone, had caused a disruption, had failed in the fundamental servant's duty of not being noticed. She dropped immediately into a curtsy, her eyes fixed on the ground, stammering apologies that would not quite form into coherent words. Forgive me, Your Grace, and only then did she register the title she had used, the automatic deference that came from recognizing expensive boots and the hem of a perfectly tailored morning coat. And the panic intensified because she had collided with someone of rank, someone who could complain to the Whitmores, someone who could cost her the only position she had in the world. "Please, don't distress yourself," a voice said, and it was a good voice, deep and warm and educated, with an undertone of genuine concern rather than aristocratic irritation. It was entirely my fault. I wasn't watching where I walked. I came here to escape the crowd for a moment, and I'm afraid I was wool-gathering. Arabella remained frozen in her curtsy, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she heard the rustle of fabric, and then home to her absolute shock that the gentleman, the Duke of Ashford himself, she now realized, had knelt in the dirt of the path, heedless of his expensive dove-grey trousers, and was retrieving the fallen shawl. He brushed it off with careful hands and then extended it toward her, and she had no choice but to reach for it, her own hands trembling violently, and when their fingers touched as she took the silk from him, she felt something pass between them like a spark of static electricity, a shock of recognition that had no rational basis but was undeniable nonetheless. She pulled her hand back quickly, clutching the shawl to her chest, and tried again to form words. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I must. I should." But her voice cracked and broke because it had been so long since she had spoken to anyone above her station, so long since anyone had spoken to her as though she were a person rather than a function, and she could feel her composure crumbling like old mortar. He was still kneeling, she realized with mounting horror, still down at her level rather than standing above her as rank and propriety demanded. And when she dared to flick her eyes up from the ground, she saw that he was studying her face with an expression of curiosity, and something else, something that looked almost like concern. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question was so simple, so ordinary, so completely devastating that Arabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "I should like to know whom I have nearly trampled," he continued, when she did not immediately answer, his tone gentle, coaxing, as though he were speaking to a frightened animal. And perhaps that was what she was, a creature so thoroughly beaten that the smallest kindness undid her entirely. The question hung in the air between them, and Arabella opened her mouth to answer, to say the words that should have been the easiest thing in the world. "My name is Arabella Fairfax," but the words would not come. It was as though her tongue had forgotten the shape of them, as though the sounds that made up her name had been buried so deep under 10 years of silence that she could not excavate them in the moment when they were needed most. She stood there, frozen, her mind scrabbling for purchase, and all she could think was, "They call me." But what did they call her? They called her girl, and you there, and nothing. They called her nothing at all. She began, and faltered. "They call me." But how could she explain that they did not call her anything, that she had no name in this household, that she had forgotten how to claim one? "I am," she tried again, but the sentence had no ending, because what was she? Who was she? The girl who had been Arabella Fairfax was gone, and in her place was this creature without identity, without voice, without the simple human right to a name. The Duke's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a concern that looked almost like alarm, and he leaned slightly closer, his grey eyes searching her face. "They call you what?" he prompted gently. "Surely you have a name. Everyone has a name." But that was not true, Arabella thought with a clarity that was almost painful. Not everyone had a name. Some people were erased so thoroughly that they became blanks, spaces where a person used to be, and she was one of them. She had let herself become one of them, and the realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. "I serve the Whitmores, Your Grace," she whispered, because that at least was true. That at least was an identity she could claim, a function if not a name. "I must return. Forgive me." And without waiting for his response, she turned and fled, the rose silk shawl clutched in her hands, her half-boots slipping on the grass as she ran. Behind her she heard him call out, "Wait, please!" But she did not stop, could not stop, because if she stayed another moment in his presence, she would shatter completely, would dissolve into tears and truth-telling, and all the things she had locked away for 10 years in order to survive. She reached the area where the tents were erected and forced herself to slow, to smooth her face into blankness, to become invisible again. And when she presented the shawl to Lady Whitmore, the older woman snatched it without a word and draped it over Lydia's shoulders, already turning back to the Duke, who had apparently returned to the main party. His moment of escape ended. Arabella retreated to her position behind the oak tree, her heart still racing, her hands still trembling, and she pressed her palm against the rough bark to steady herself, to anchor herself to something solid and real. "What is your name?" he had asked, and the question echoed in her mind like a bell, like a summons, like a door opening onto a room she had locked and forgotten. "Arabella," she thought fiercely. "My name is Arabella Fairfax. My mother was Emmeline. My father was Thomas. I had a name once. I have a name still, even if no one speaks it, even if I have forgotten how to speak it myself." She watched the Duke from her hidden vantage point and saw that he was looking around the crowd with an expression of distraction, as though he were searching for something. And once his gaze swept in her direction and she pressed herself more firmly behind the tree, terrified that he might see her, might approach her, might ask again the question she could not answer. But he was called away by Lord Somebody, drawn into a conversation with a cluster of gentlemen, and Arabella released a breath she had not known she was holding. The afternoon wore on with excruciating slowness, the sun climbing higher and then beginning its descent, the crowd thinning as people departed for their next engagements, and through it all, Arabella stood and waited, and tried not to think about the moment on the path, the touch of his fingers against hers, the way he had knelt in the dirt as though her dignity mattered as much as his own. Lydia was in a foul temper on the ride home. The Duke had been polite, but not particularly attentive, had danced attendance on her for precisely the amount of time courtesy demanded, and not a moment longer. And she blamed Arabella for taking too long with the shawl, for failing to return before his interest wandered, as though Arabella's brief absence had somehow cost her a duchess's coronet. "You are useless," Lydia hissed as they climbed into the carriage. "Utterly useless. I should have father dismiss you and find someone competent." But even as she spoke the words, both of them knew they were empty, because Arabella worked for no wages, and no lady's maid could be hired for free. That night, in her attic room, Arabella sat on her narrow bed and pressed her hands against her face. And in the privacy and darkness, she whispered the words she had not been able to say that afternoon. "My name is Arabella Fairfax," she told the empty air. "Arabella Fairfax, Arabella," and the sound of it in her own voice was strange and foreign and achingly familiar all at once, like coming home to a house that had been locked for years, finding it still standing but filled with dust and shadows. She thought of the Duke's grey eyes, the genuine confusion on his face when she could not answer his simple question, the way he had looked at her as though she were a puzzle he wanted to solve, and for the first time in 10 years she felt something other than resignation or despair. She felt a tiny fragile spark of something that might have been hope, or might have been simply the memory of what hope used to feel like when she still believed the world held possibilities for girls like her. Sebastian Wentworth had not been able to stop thinking about the woman in the park, which was absurd and troubling in equal measure, because he was a man who prided himself on rational thought and disciplined emotion. Yet for 2 weeks, the memory of her had haunted him with the persistence of a melody he could not name. He found himself distracted during meetings with his steward, during sessions in the House of Lords, during the endless round of social obligations that consumed a duke's London season, and always his mind returned to that moment on the secluded path, to her trembling hands and broken voice, to the look of genuine confusion that had crossed her face when he asked her name, as though the question were in a language she no longer spoke. He had made inquiries, carefully and discreetly, about the Whitmore household, and what he learned troubled him deeply. Lord Whitmore was known to be financially strained despite maintaining appearances, his investments consistently poor, his debts mounting, his standing in society sustained more by the memory of past prosperity than present reality. Lady Whitmore was ambitious and cold, determined to marry her daughter well enough to restore the family fortunes, and there were whispers, never quite substantiated, about a ward who had lived with them years ago, a cousin's daughter who had simply disappeared from society without explanation. When the invitation to dine at the Whitmore residence arrived, Sebastian would normally have declined with a polite excuse, as he declined most such invitations from families with unmarried daughters. But this time he found himself accepting, his curiosity overriding his usual caution, and Lady Whitmore's reply had been effusive, with transparent delight at having secured the presence of the season's most eligible bachelor. The evening of the dinner he dressed with unusual care, his valet noting with raised eyebrows that his Grace seemed particularly concerned with the arrangement of his cravat, and Sebastian ignored the implied question because he could not have explained even to himself why he felt this strange sense of anticipation, this feeling that the evening would reveal something important, though he could not say what. The Whitmore townhouse was elegant in a faded way, the drawing-room furniture slightly worn beneath its costly upholstery, the silver plate tarnished at the edges, the very air seeming to carry the scent of genteel decline. Sebastian was received with great ceremony, Lady Whitmore fluttering about him with compliments and offers of the best sherry, Lord Whitmore emerging from behind his newspaper long enough to shake hands and make ponderous remarks about the weather and the state of the markets, and Lydia Whitmore positioned strategically on the sofa in a gown of celestial blue that had clearly been chosen to complement her eyes. The other guests were minor nobility and wealthy gentry, the kind of people who could be counted on to spread word of the Duke's attendance throughout London society, and Sebastian recognized the dinner for what it was, a calculated display meant to associate the Whitmore name with his own, to suggest a connection that did not yet exist, and might never exist if he had any say in the matter. But his attention was not on the drawing-room theatrics or the transparent matchmaking. His attention was fixed on the periphery, on the shadows at the edges of the room where a figure moved silently, adjusting candlesticks, straightening cushions. And when she stepped briefly into the light to refill someone's glass, he felt his breath catch because it was her, the woman from the park, and in the 2 weeks since their encounter, he had almost convinced himself that he had imagined the strange pull he felt toward her, the sense of recognition that had no rational basis, but seeing her again, he knew he had imagined nothing. She wore the same grey dress, or one identical to it, her hair pulled severely back, her movements economical and practiced, and what struck him most forcefully was her invisibility. The way the other guests looked through her as though she were a piece of furniture, the way Lady Whitmore gestured at her without speaking to her, the way she seemed to exist in the room without occupying any space in the awareness of those present. Sebastian watched her throughout the evening with growing fury that he struggled to contain beneath his usual mask of aristocratic courtesy, watched as she anticipated needs before they were spoken, as she fetched Lady Whitmore's medicine and Lord Whitmore's spectacles as she moved through the room like a ghost, fulfilling the requests of the living. When dinner was announced, she did not join them at table, of course. Servants did not dine with family and guests. But she was present in the dining room, standing against the wall between the sideboards, ready to assist the footman, and Sebastian positioned himself at table so that he could observe her without being obvious about it. He made conversation with Lady Whitmore on his right and the wife of a minor baronet on his left. He praised the excellence of the turtle soup and the delicacy of the fish course. He laughed at Lord Whitmore's laboured jokes and appeared to listen attentively to Lydia's breathless observations about the latest opera. But all the while his true attention was on the woman in grey, waiting and watching for her name. The test came during the fourth course when a napkin beside Lady Whitmore's plate was apparently folded incorrectly, the linen not quite aligned in the elaborate fan shape that fashion demanded, and Lady Whitmore's voice cut across the table conversation with the sharpness of a blade. "This is folded completely wrong," she announced to no one in particular. "You there, did you set this place? Because if so, you have done it incorrectly yet again. One would think after 10 years you could manage something as simple as a napkin." Sebastian saw the woman's face, saw the way it remained carefully blank, even as something flickered in her amber eyes, oceans of suppressed feeling visible for just a moment before being ruthlessly contained, and he felt his hand tighten on his wine-glass with the effort of not speaking, of not saying what he wanted to say, which was that Lady Whitmore was a petty tyrant who deserved neither respect nor service. The woman, still unnamed, moved forward silently and refolded the napkin with deft fingers. Her head bowed and retreated to her position against the wall, and not once during the entire exchange did Lady Whitmore look at her directly or use any form of address that acknowledged her humanity. Sebastian filed away this observation, along with all the others he had collected throughout the evening, the casual cruelties, the deliberate erasures, the systematic denial of personhood, and he felt his resolve hardening into something that was not quite anger, but rather a cold determination to understand what was happening in this household, and why. After dinner, the company retired to the drawing-room for coffee and cards, the gentlemen having dispensed with the usual separation, and port in deference to the Duke's known preference for mixed company, and Sebastian settled himself in a chair that gave him a view of the entire room, watching as the woman in grey cleared away coffee cups and straightened chairs and remained utterly invisible to everyone except himself. He waited until the evening began to wind down, until guests started making their farewells, and then he rose and made a show of patting his pockets and looking around with an expression of mild concern. "I seem to have misplaced my gloves," he announced to Lady Whitmore. "I believe I may have left them in the drawing-room when we went into dinner. Pray do not trouble yourself. I shall retrieve them directly." And before she could offer to send a servant, he was already moving toward the door. The drawing-room was dim, the candles burning low in their sconces, and the air smelled of beeswax and the dying roses that filled a vase on the mantelpiece, their petals beginning to brown at the edges. She was there, as he had hoped she would be, moving quietly about the room collecting stray glasses and crumpled napkins, and when he entered, she looked up with a start of surprise and immediate fear, her body going still as a rabbit who has sensed a fox. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not mean to disturb you. I shall leave at once." But Sebastian raised a hand to forestall her. "Please do not go," he said gently. "I am the one intruding on your work, and I wonder if I might speak with you for a moment." Her eyes went to the door, calculating escape routes and consequences, and he could see the war being fought behind her carefully blank expression, the desire to flee warring with the impossibility of refusing a direct request from a duke. "I have attended many dinners, miss," he began, pausing deliberately to give her the opportunity to supply her name, but she remained silent, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. He tried again, more directly. I notice your employers do not address you by name. Is this customary in this household? She stopped moving at that, her back to him, and for a long moment she did not respond. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. It is not my place to have a name, Your Grace, she said. I am a servant. The words hit him like a physical blow, the quiet resignation in her voice, the absolute conviction that she had no right to the most basic marker of human identity. And Sebastian felt something shift in his chest, a crack opening in the careful control he maintained over his emotions. Every person has a name, he said, keeping his voice gentle despite the anger rising in him. Every person has a place. Yours has been taken from you, I think. She turned then, and he saw that her eyes were glistening with unshed tears, her composure crumbling at the edges in a way that made her look both younger and infinitely older than he had first thought. Why do you care? She asked, and the question was not hostile, but genuinely bewildered, as though kindness from a stranger were so foreign to her experience that she could not fathom its motivation. Because in a room full of people performing elaborate social dances, Sebastian replied with complete honesty, You are the only real person I have encountered in months. Everyone else is playing a role, performing a part. But you are simply trying to survive with your dignity intact, and I find that more compelling than all the artifice of the ton combined. He took a step closer, careful not to crowd her, careful to leave her space to retreat if she wished. Please, he said, and he heard the note of pleading in his own voice and did not try to disguise it. Tell me your name. She stood there looking at him, and he could see the internal struggle written across her features, the decade of conditioning that told her she had no right to claim an identity warring with something deeper, some part of her that remembered being a person, being someone. And he waited with his heart hammering in his chest, because he knew somehow that this moment mattered, that what she said or did not say would determine something crucial, though he could not have articulated what. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of their breathing and the distant rumble of carriages in the street outside. And then she drew a breath that seemed to come from the very depths of her being, and spoke. Arabella, she said, so quietly he almost missed it. My name is Arabella Fairfax. The words hung in the air between them like something sacred, like a resurrection, and Sebastian felt an emotion he could not quite name rising in his throat, something that was part triumph and part grief and part awe at the courage it had taken for her to speak those simple words. Arabella, he repeated, and he said it gently, reverently, like a prayer or a promise, like the most important word he had ever learned. Arabella Fairfax, and as he spoke her name he saw something change in her face, saw her spine straighten slightly, saw her lift her chin just a fraction of an inch, as though hearing her name spoken aloud with respect and care had reminded her that she was real, that she existed, that she mattered. She was crying now, silent tears sliding down her cheeks, and she made no move to wipe them away, just stood there, with her name hanging in the air between them and her true self visible for perhaps the first time in 10 years. Sebastian wanted to say more, wanted to ask 1,000 questions about how she had come to this place, how a woman named Arabella Fairfax, with education evident, in her speech and bearing had ended up erased and unnamed in the Whitmore household. But he heard voices in the corridor, the party breaking up, guests departing, and he knew their moment of privacy was ending. Thank you, he said softly, for trusting me with your name, Arabella. I shall not forget it. And then he collected his gloves, which he had deliberately left on a side table earlier in the evening, and moved toward the door. As he passed her, he paused and spoke quietly, so that only she could hear. "You deserve better than this, Arabella Fairfax, and I intend to discover how you came to be here and what might be done to restore what has been taken from you." She looked up at him with